Hello and welcome to the Northern Myths podcast, where we explore the myths and legends of Northern Europe from an archetypal perspective. I'm Luke DeWolf.
And I'm Dan Larrabee.
In this episode, we'd like to properly introduce you to our show. We explore some of the most interesting and exciting myths and legends from Northern Europe, including the Poetic Edda from Norse mythology and the Finnish epic poem, the Kalevala. We also conduct interviews with interesting guests who have their own ideas about these stories. We explore these myths and legends from an archetypal perspective, which means that we look at the patterns in these stories and try to extract the lessons that we can apply to everyday life.
And in fact, we believe that each one of us is living a myth. In other words, that the way that we live our lives and the things that we face follow along the same patterns as these timeless stories. And if you can find out what myth you're living, you might be able to see how it's going to end. And maybe you like the ending, or maybe you don't. And if you don't like the ending, there's still time to do something about it. And that's what finding the myth you're living is all about. And that's the reason that we do the show. And there are many instances in history where we can see that looking back, we can see the myth that was being lived out. And maybe if they had known what myth they were living, things would have ended differently.
Absolutely. The whole idea of finding the myth you're living, that's a big part of our show. And when we're exploring these stories, we're really trying to find how we can apply the lessons to everyday life. That's what that means. And so if you're joining us for the first time, or you've been a long-time listener, we hope that you find this idea of finding the myth you're living to be something that's impactful and helpful, and that you find as much meaning through it as we do.
Absolutely. It's something that these myths have really caught us. And actually, as we talk in this introduction episode, you'll see what we mean by that and just how deeply ingrained these are into us.
Definitely. And before we dig a little bit deeper into the stories that we cover and some of our major influences, just a quick note, the best way to support us is our Patreon. And if you'd like to connect with us, we're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. All the links are in the description. And don't forget to like and subscribe on YouTube. So I think we can dig into the content now.
Let's do it. So a little bit about us. We obviously have a shared interest in mythology, history, philosophy. We actually became friends by bonding over Norse mythology. And the way this podcast came about was that we had seen deep dives into other mythologies and religions, but nothing about the Norse mythology, which we both liked. And I know for myself, grade 6, I did my big speech on the Viking voyage to North America. So this has been in me for a long time. Fairly certain it's been in you for a long time as well. And we knew these stories, and we didn't know much about them. And we didn't see people start taking them apart as you might see in Hinduism, or Greek mythology is another great example. There's been tons written about Greek mythology. So we decided that, why not give it a try? Which sounds a little arrogant. However, Luke, would you like to address that?
Well, yeah, exactly. And the whole point here is that we're not experts, not even close. Neither of us has studied any of this stuff formally or anything like that. We're completely self-taught. We just really enjoy these stories. And Dan, you were saying you were into some of this Viking stuff as early as grade 6. The Finnish stuff was actually kind of my first real dig into this stuff. So I was super excited when we started to do Kalevala, but then the Norse kind of came as an after effect of that for me. So we're just exploring this stuff. We really like it. And all the ideas that we find within these stories, it's based on the work of some really smart people who know a lot more than us. We'll explain a little bit more than that in just a bit here. But what's important is that we don't know everything, and we can be wrong. If we ever get something wrong, like feel free to let us know. We're happy to, first of all, make a correction or have a discussion about, like different perspectives. Yeah, feel free to reach out. We love hearing new ideas about these stories. And yeah, just remember, we're not trying to be experts or, impart our wisdom or anything like that, such as it is. We're just reading these stories and trying to get as much out of it as we can, and hoping to share some of our love for these stories along the way.
For whatever reason, we've decided to record ourselves learning in front of people and falling on our faces, hopefully in a humorous way sometimes. But yeah, that's just sort of what we want to do, is that we want to be able to learn as much as we can, and opening it up like this and having other people chime in and being able to talk with actual experts is really the best way we've found to educate ourselves. Really, this is a very selfish project on our part.
Exactly. And actually, you mentioning the experts there, maybe before we get into the stories, I'll just mention that we have some really cool interviews on the show. We get to talk to a lot of awesome people. And yeah, it's anything from experts like academics who really know their stuff, like have studied this for a really long time. And we're always excited to hear what they say. And then we even talk to like folks like musicians who have their own unique take on this stuff, or sometimes authors of more modern day books and things like that, who kind of, we see them as applying some of these timeless lessons into the world. And so that's one of the really exciting things. And we didn't start out exactly with the idea that we might be doing these interviews, but it's really helped us. And honestly, they've been some of our most popular episodes, I think.
For sure. And I know I learned so much from everyone that we interview, like you're saying, experts, academics, and people that actually are still sort of living these stories because they were brought up in the culture, and their understanding of it wasn't through books. It was from listening to grandmother tell something while she was baking in the kitchen, kind of thing. Like really incredible stuff. And I think now is a good time to talk about other stories that we use, sort of the backbone of what stories we look at in our podcast. So of course, starting off with the Norse mythology, the Poetic Edda. The Poetic Edda, it's a collection of poems in the Old Norse language. These poems are basically one of the only sources we have of the myths of the Old Norse gods. It was written down around the year 1270 in Iceland, but the poems, of course, were composed earlier. No one's really sure about who compiled the poems. We've got some ideas, but scholars, of course, argue about it, and we're not entirely sure. They were probably composed before the year 1000 in Norway as opposed to Iceland, even though Iceland plays a major role in where we get both the Poetic and Prose Edda, and sort of the maintenance of these stories so that we can actually look at them today. Now, the stories in the Poetic Edda, they include, all the famous gods, Thor, Loki, Odin, Freya and Freyr. Basically literally everything that we know about these gods comes from the Poetic and Prose Edda. Some sagas, but they aren't necessarily, there are mythological components to it, but they're generally seen as like history about certain people. Whereas like the Poetic Edda is like myth. It's about gods. It's about, how gods fight ice giants, things like that. Things that are in the Poetic Edda that are sort of worth mentioning. The Voluspa, which talks about everything from the creation of the world all the way to the doom of the gods and the destruction of the world in Ragnarok and the rebirth afterwards. It includes the Havamal, which is the Book of Wisdom, which is attributed to Odin, and many other exciting, interesting stories. You'll actually find like ones that you haven't necessarily seen or heard of before. One that's, I guess, fairly popular in Norse circles, but I really like is the Lay of Rig, about Heimdall and how he sort of created society. So there's just an unlimited amount of good stuff in the Poetic Edda. And I imagine one day we'll move on to the prose Edda, but right now the Poetic Edda is more than enough to fill our time. The translation that we read is by Dr. Jackson Crawford. It's one of the most easily readable translations and is still quite accurate. We've had a chance to talk to Dr. Crawford a couple times. He's really one of our favorite people. And not only because he and his publisher, Hackett Publishing, allow us to use their books on our show and read from them. He is actually just a super interesting guy, and we couldn't do this without him. And definitely check out his YouTube channel because he goes into these topics in depth that we could never hope to reach, just because like he is an actual expert. He's one of the experts that we talk about when we're talking about experts. And yeah, that's kind of what we do for Norse mythology so far. If we do this long enough, I'm sure we'll get into sagas, the prose Eddas, maybe even like grim fairy tales. I mean, those aren't too far off from mythology that we're looking at. But it's really neat to be able to look at these stories that, in some ways, if you come from Europe at any point, like within, whether it's like yesterday or, you had family on the Mayflower, these stories were told by your ancestors and to your ancestors. And so it's neat to hear these old stories and sort of try and figure out what lessons they were learning to be able to survive and thrive in the world.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, there's as you said, there's no shortage of these kinds of stories from the Norse and the Germanic peoples in general. And so, yeah, I think we're really never going to run out of material to explore, which is super exciting. And of course, now the other major work that we cover is the Kalevala from Finland. The Kalevala is the national epic poem of Finland, in fact, and it was compiled by Elias Lönnrot in the mid-1800s in an attempt to collect the folk poetry of Finland and Karelia, which is kind of like Eastern Finland. Part of it's in Russia a little bit. The poems in the Kalevala, they were passed down through oral tradition. The Poetic Edda is kind of the same, but when it was written down is kind of where the difference is. This was written down much later, like in the 1800s, as opposed to the 1200s there for the Poetic Edda. The Kalevala was an important part in developing Finnish national identity, especially kind of in the 1800s. Finland was always either a subject of Sweden or Russia for the last few hundred years up until 1917 when Finland became independent from Russia. And it was really important in developing kind of this national identity and this national culture that really bound the people all together and to create a modern nation. And the Kalevala is seen as an important part of Finnish culture even today, with examples all over, kind of just even like everyday products or brands or things like that have influence from the Kalevala, but also just even cultural production. Some music and things like that is based on the Kalevala and things along those lines. So it's really important and in Finland, and we just really enjoy exploring the Kalevala. The stories in Kalevala, they range from the mythological to the heroic, and what I mean by that is it actually includes like things like the creation myths and things like that, and how society developed mythologically, but also a lot of stuff that is just kind of purely heroic in nature. One of the main heroes of the Kalevala is the wizard Väinämöinen, who was a major influence actually on the character Gandalf in the Lord of the Rings, along with Odin. So if you can kind of picture Gandalf and kind of Odin and things like that, very similar to Väinämöinen. He's kind of this old wizard who's kind of the expert in a whole bunch of different things. He's a poet, a musician. He plays the kantele, which is a Finnish instrument, kind of like a harp or a zither. And Väinämöinen's adventures, Väinämöinen and other characters such as Ilmarinen, Lemminkäinen, Joukahainen, Kullervo, they all have exciting adventures, which we really enjoy exploring as we read the Kalevala. And kind of in tone, it's a little bit different from the Poetic Edda, which is currently what we've read so far is very mythological. But in the Kalevala, they're sometimes a little more personal, a little more heroic, and it's kind of following along with these adventures. So it's really exciting. We enjoy the Kalevala very much. We read the translation by W.F. Kirby, which is freely available and in the public domain. It's reasonably accurate. The language is still a bit archaic. It's probably the best translation which is freely available, so we can read it on our show. But the translation that we would recommend as an alternative to Kirby's is by Keith Bosley. And we can't read it on the show due to licensing restrictions, but it's the one that we refer to when we're preparing for the show. And if we would recommend you pick up a copy if you'd like to follow along in the same way. So that's the Kalevala. And I was interested in Finnish mythology and the Kalevala before we started the show, but this was new to you, Dan, right?
That's right. The Kalevala was completely brand new. And when we talked about doing it, we'd had a few people ask us to look into it, and you knew about it, so you were gung-ho right from the first moment. And I'm a sucker for mythology, so I was good to go too, but I had no idea what I was in for, and it has carved out this place in my heart. It's just amazing. I love the stories. I don't think I've ever felt some of the mythological characters in other mythologies as much as I do in the Kalevala, particularly Aino. We've got some episodes on that. I don't remember how many. Was it 3?
That one I think is 3.
That was a heavy duty story to go through. I know we both felt the effects of that one for a while. So love the Kalevala. Can't get enough.
And 50 poems or runos as they call them, and we're only on number 9 right now at the release of this episode, and so long way to go with that one, and it's going to take quite a long time before we're done. So no worries about running out of the material on that side again either.
Yeah, we could do this until we die quite easily. Fingers crossed. So in addition to these basically primary sources are these stories, we also read some other things that help us try and understand the patterns that we're seeing in these stories and figure out why these stories are told, age through age, person to person, like what's so cool and important about them. And one of the first people that we should mention that we read is Carl Jung. He was Sigmund Freud's student, and they had a falling out. So I'm actually not sure if he'd be considered a psychoanalyst or not, because that's Sigmund Freud's school. But he was right there with developing psychiatry and psychology as we know it today. His big thing was the archetypes. And it's the idea that there are these symbols that we all embody or sometimes embody us. Maybe the hero, a king, a queen, a mother, a tyrant, a devouring, scary, evil godmother kind of thing. There are very many archetypes, and you can read all about them in his work and people that have come after him. Some of the works that we've read that have really helped shape our understanding of archetypes. And again, we're not experts, but I think we're at a point where we might know what we don't know and can ask the right questions. But some of the books that we've read that are quite helpful have been Man and His Symbols. I know for myself, when I read that book in particular, my dreams became very archetypal and very plainly archetypal. Like there was no like humming and hawing about, oh, what could this mean? It was very clear what my dreams meant. And it actually turns out whenever I read Jung, my dreams kind of go like super crazy, which is a warning. I've heard this with other people too, that if you read Jung, like be ready for your dreams to get like hyper realistic, and like the meaning is gets very deep and powerful. As well, he's also got his archetypes in the collective unconscious, again going over the archetypes and the culture that people are brought up in. That's what he means by collective unconscious. Some people will talk about, they'll actually try and discredit him, saying like, oh, it's this mysterious thing in the ether that we're all connected and have the same dream. It's like, it's not quite that. It's, if you're brought up in a culture, you're inundated with symbols from the moment you can see. And because of that, we all have basically the same frames of reference for things in our culture. And that's sort of what he means by collective unconscious. And it's something that you can't get away from, because you are born in a particular time and place in a particular culture. That's part of how you understand how the world works. The only other book there's actually two other books. We haven't really talked about them on the podcast, but just like for extra credit, as it were, there's one that he wrote called Aion, A-I-O-N. That one's insane, very good, but insane. And then he's got one called, well, I don't know if he actually named it. It's called The Red Book. And as insane as Aion is, this one is like even crazier, because he sort of forgets. It's not academic at all. It's just like him talking about his dreams and mystical experiences. However, it's still, if you like his other writing, you'll probably like this, because he doesn't just write about it. He actually practices a lot of what he's talking about. So it's a very real and raw experience of like of being a human. So those are like the books that you should check out with him. He's got many others. He was a prolific writer, but those are sort of the ones that we have read and used to talk about the myths that we look at.
Yeah, Jung is absolutely foundational to this stuff, and even though, I mean, he's a couple hundred years removed from kind of modern times, he's still incredibly relevant and has ideas. Like there are quotes of his that could apply to the modern day, absolutely. And some of these books are great. Ion, like you mentioned, is quite something. Like that one is really insane is the right word for it. That one is quite something. Beyond Jung, there was a particular student of Jung named Erich Neumann, and he kind of expanded on some of his ideas in a few particular ways, and specifically the book "The Origins and History of Consciousness." That book, I think, in particular, is really quite good in terms of distilling a lot of the ideas of Jung in a little bit more of an accessible way, and expanding on them a fair bit. He's got other books as well. One of the ones on kind of my reading list is called The Great Mother, and it's an exploration of I would say one of the most foundational archetypes, as in like, you can't go anywhere without exploring the Great Mother archetype, and well, if we get into the show a little bit more, I mean, we see examples of it everywhere, and so that's just another book on the reading list, because these are long and deep books, but these are just some things that we're aware of from Erich Neumann, who would be another good source.
Exactly. Erich Neumann is, I won't say required reading, but it's great. It'll give you a great understanding of what Jung is talking about. And then, of course, if we're going to talk about Carl Jung, we can't miss this person, Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell is probably one of the most famous student of Jung. I mean, he wrote the book The Hero with a Thousand Faces. All of the best movies or books you've ever read or seen they are based on his hero cycle, about the hero and the crisis and going into the underworld and fighting the dragon to get the gold that he can bring back to his home. There are people I know in Hollywood who literally are hired to make sure that scripts are following this cycle. And you can actually buy a lot of their books in like the letters section of your nearest bookstore, like with the poetry and things like that. I guess you can almost say he's like the framework for the stories as we understand them today. He's done a bunch of stuff. Like I said, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. I had a PBS series called The Power of Myth with Bill Moyers. It was at least on Canadian Netflix for quite a while. I don't know if it's still on there. It's worth searching for on Netflix, and if you can find it, I think it's 6 episodes. Like, it's a great 6 hours because you learn a ton. Then there's The Masks of God, where he compares like religions and sort of their understandings, and believe it or not, there are quite a few similarities between all of them. And then he also has a magnum opus, which I haven't read, but it's like a 6-volume set that looks at all of the myths within like every continent, and goes through the various ages, like Bronze Age, Agricultural Age, that kind of thing. He unfortunately died before he could complete it, but you can sort of see where he was going with it because it's so big, and definitely worth checking out. I think it's called, again, like The Power of Mythology or Ancient Mythology, but we can put a link to it and things like that.
Definitely, and maybe just to clarify something as well. When you say, I know what you're saying when you say, all of these stories are based on Joseph Campbell, but it's really that Joseph Campbell went and observed the patterns in stories, and then when he wrote down what he saw in all these mythologies, he wrote it down in such a way that's so good, like it just sells perfectly. So that's why it makes sense for these Hollywood types to get into it. Like I think wasn't it George Lucas with Star Wars and everything, like he was a big fan of Joseph Campbell, things like that.
Absolutely. He directly used Hero with a Thousand Faces and the heroic journey to write Star Wars. And the PBS special, The Power of Myths, is actually recorded at Skywalker Ranch, which at the time George Lucas still owned. I think he had sold it. Either way, another interesting person who uses it in every episode that he creates is I think his name is Dan Harmon, who does Rick and Morty. He makes sure that every episode follows the heroic journey. And I think there's like one that didn't, and he like regrets it to this day, hates it, wishes he could go back and make sure that it stuck to the cycle. So even if you haven't read the book or looked at Joseph Campbell at all, he's one of the most influential people in our society and in your life, believe it or not.
Right, and the reason it ties back to these myths and things like that is that, I mean, he wasn't pulling these ideas out of nothing. He was looking at all these stories from throughout history. And once you kind of start to read what he has kind of codified there together, well, it becomes impossible not to start to see the patterns yourself, which is really what we're doing, I think. And then another figure that is kind of on the same lines as far as the comparative religion side of things is Mircea Eliade, and he was a scholar of religion. And the main book that we use to kind of compare religious ideas and find examples from other cultures is his History of Religious Ideas book. It's a 3-parter, and it's quite long, but the first part of the three is really the one that we compare most to these different mythologies. It's got examples from all over the world and from many different time periods, and so you can start to see like there's examples from tens to even hundreds of thousands of years ago that show evidence that that people understood these myths or religion was kind of similar in different ways. And really, it just helps to flesh out the ideas that we see in these stories because we have other examples and we know what they mean. Therefore, we can figure out what they mean in the Norse or the Finnish or whatever we're covering. And so those have been very helpful. And Eliade has some other books as well, but A History of Religious Ideas is one of the big ones. The Sacred and the Profane is probably the outside of the history of religious ideas. That one is probably the one that's most influential for me, just in terms of how it describes the ideas of the sacred and the holy and how it relates to and how it's different from kind of the regular world, the mundane world. And it's a concept that kind of undergirds religion in general. And so that's another great book.
It really is a great book. I love his section on liminal space, especially because I think it applies so much to a lot of the myths that we read. Liminal space in itself is almost mythical because it's not really it's neither here nor there. It's this weird spot in between, which is kind of a mythical place on its own, and really helps with understanding what people were talking about or thinking about when they would hear these stories. So it's like I would say it's sort of compulsory. Like you're missing so much if you're not reading him.
Yeah, Eliade is great. One of my favorites and definitely one of the most helpful when I was starting to dig into this stuff a bit more. Reading Eliade really helped to kind of see these different examples. Again, it was just so helpful to see them explained a little bit better. And now I think our kind of our final major influence, and we've been taking this chronologically in terms of who came first, who came next, sort of thing, because their ideas would be building off of one another's essentially for a long time. So the last major influence chronologically for us is Dr. Jordan Peterson. And his ideas are best summed up in his book, Maps of Meaning. And in this book, his main ideas are about how the world is divided up into the known and the unknown, order and chaos, and how the world is really all about navigating between those things. Like the way that everyone acts in the world is about going from the known to the unknown, going from the explored territory to the unexplored territory, and how you get there and how you figure that out. And his main idea is that myths and stories provide examples of how to navigate the world. And by examining stories, we can really see, like, how did someone do something successfully? Like a good hero story. The hero rescues the princess or slays the dragon or something like that. And maybe you're not literally doing exactly those things, but maybe it's something similar. And maybe it's something that just helps to say, okay, here is how you could best achieve a goal or venture out into the unknown and make something productive out of that. So these ideas are really the types of meaning that we're trying to find in these stories. And Dr. Peterson's work, I think, really tied all this together for us. Like the way he summarizes all of these ideas together, and he also does comparisons with other religions and mythologies in Maps of Meaning. The way he pulls it all together really helped us to see and understand what was going on here. And really, I would say at the end of the day, he's probably the primary influence that got us started into digging into all of these others that came before him.
He was probably the one that made me realize that you could look into these stories the way that he does. So, yeah, we would be remiss to say that he wasn't a big influence on what we've done. And then to sort of sum up what we're doing here, it's always good to go to people who are better at speaking or better at writing than you. And so I'm going to turn to Joseph Campbell. And this was the first question that Bill Moyers asked him in his special, The Power of Myth. And Bill Moyers basically said, so why myth? And Joseph Campbell responded with this quote, "My first response would be, go on, live your life. It's a good life. You don't need mythology. I don't believe in being interested in a subject just because it's said to be important. I believe in being caught by it somehow or other. But you may find that with a proper introduction, mythology will catch you. And so, what can it do for you if it does catch you? One of our problems today is that we are not well acquainted with the literature of the spirit. We're interested in the news of the day and the problems of the hour. It used to be that the university campus was a kind of hermetically sealed off area where the news of the day did not impinge upon your attention to the inner life and to the magnificent human heritage we have in our great tradition. Plato, Confucius, the Buddha, Goethe, and others who speak of the eternal values that have to do with the centering of our lives. When you get to be older, and the concerns of the day have all been attended to, and you turn to the inner life, well, if you don't know where it is or what it is, you'll be sorry. Greek and Latin and biblical literature used to be part of everyone's education. Now when these were dropped, a whole tradition of Occidental mythological information was lost. It used to be that these stories were in the minds of people. When the story is in your mind, then you see its relevance to something happening in your own life. It gives you perspective on what's happening to you. With the loss of that, we've really lost something because we don't have a comparable literature to take its place. These bits of information from ancient times, which have to do with the themes that have supported human life, built civilizations, and informed religions over the millennia, have to do with deep inner problems, inner mysteries, inner thresholds of passage. And if you don't know what the guide signs are along the way, you have to work it out for yourself. But once this subject catches you, there is such a feeling from one or another of these traditions of information of a deep, rich, life-vivifying sort that you don't want to give up." End quote. And I would say, for me, that sums up how I feel about these stories and mythology in general.
Absolutely. It's a fantastic quote. And really it does sum it up, because this is information that's been with us for a long time, a really long time. Basically, as long as humanity has been in existence, we've been telling stories. At least that's what the evidence suggests. And so, yeah, I think for us, going back and learning from this stuff is really important, and figuring out how we can apply it. That's the end goal, right? And going on and living life without it now doesn't seem possible to me.
No, it's impossible. I'll say it right here now, impossible.
Definitely. And so that's our show. This is the Northern Myths podcast. This is what we do. We're exploring these stories to try and find the meaning. And we're going off of the influence and the work of much smarter people. We're not experts, but we're hoping that we can provide something valuable. And if you'd like to come along with us for the journey, we're learning at the same time, but hopefully you can learn something too, and you enjoy your time with us, and you enjoy learning about these stories as much as we do. So I think that's about everything for an introduction to our show.
I think you're right. I think the only thing left is to go check out some of our episodes and start reading these stories.
I would agree. Great. Well, I think with that being it for today, I'll just remind you here the best way you can support our show, if you like, is our Patreon, and we do have quite a few things and some plans for our Patreon at the moment. If you support us for $1 per episode, something like that, we are doing kind of behind the scenes updates and showing you a little bit more about the show in general. And we do provide early access to episodes up to a week early as soon as we've edited them, essentially, for $5 per episode or more. And we've got some plans for the future, but we'll see where it goes. If you're willing to support us, we want to give as much value for that as possible. And if you'd like to connect with us, we're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and you can connect with us through any of those means. We'll put links to all of them in the description. As well, if you're not on social media, you can email us directly at northernmythspodcast@gmail.com. And on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe. So, Dan, I think that's everything, unless I'm missing something.
Well, Luke, there is one thing, and it's the most important thing. And that's to thank you for joining us, and we hope you find the myth that you're living. This has been the Northern Myths Podcast.